Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics. Thank you so much for being here. In today's video, we are going to be talking about driftwood, everything you need to know about the most common types of driftwood. We're going to show you what they look like in an aquarium, talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each. Thank you so much for being here. Hope you enjoy the video. So when it comes to driftwood, most of you know that it can be an awesome addition to your aquarium. It provides a really natural look for your ecosystem. Not only that, but if you want the driftwood to release some tannins, give you a little bit of that brown or black water look to your aquarium, it can add to that natural look. And those tannins are actually antimicrobial and can make your aquarium even healthier. The other purpose of driftwood is that it can sometimes grow biofilms, and some of your fish or shrimp or snails like to feed on that, so it actually becomes a food source. And for some plecos, they actually require wood in their diet. The other nice thing about driftwood is if you have an aquarium with a low carbonate hardness, KH, sometimes driftwood can be used to actually lower the pH of your environment. All right, so let's get into it. The first type of driftwood, and one I think is most common, is this right here. This is Malaysian driftwood. This is a medium-sized piece that you see right here. Usually they look a lot like this. Sometimes they're a little thicker than this piece is. Malaysian driftwood, probably the most common that you're going to find in the aquarium hobby. Now, there are some advantages to this. A, it is common, and B, in terms of the cost, it's going to be some of the least costly driftwood that we talk about today. They also come in some really large pieces, and so if you're somebody who has a very, very large aquarium, Malaysian driftwood might be for you because it can fill up a lot of space very, very quickly. The other nice thing about Malaysian driftwood is it tends to waterlog and sink relatively fast compared to a lot of the other woods that we're going to talk about in this video. And so while some wood, when you put it in the tank, it will float, the Malaysian driftwood can do that too, but if you soak it for a little while, especially for smaller pieces, if you're able to boil it, that's going to allow it to sink a lot faster. Now, there are some downsides to the Malaysian driftwood, one being that this is some of the softer type of wood that we're going to talk about today, and it tends to break down in the aquarium a little faster than other types of wood. And as far as those tannins go, if you're not somebody who likes that black water look or having brown tea-colored water, the Malaysian driftwood releases more tannins into water than just about any other type of driftwood we're going to talk about today. It also has a tendency to grow that white film on the driftwood when you put it in, usually after a few days, but that tends to go away pretty quickly. And by the way, if you want to know how to get rid of that white fuzzy stuff, check out that video in the upper right-hand corner, as well as in the description below. We talk about how to get rid of it. Now, this is all relative, of course, but as far as driftwood goes, the Malaysian driftwood tends to be the most blocky, the most chunky, and possibly the least interesting when it comes to just the overall shape and dimensions. Next up on the list, if you thought the Malaysian driftwood was okay, but you wanted something with a little bit more visual interest, check this out. This is Mopani driftwood. This is also a very common type of driftwood. Now, advantages. You get some really interesting shapes. You get some interesting shade variation within the wood as well. Usually the two sides are going to look very different. This tends to be the less attractive side. The Mopani's always got an attractive, more smooth side, and then usually a little bit of a rougher side. Just like the Malaysian driftwood, there are some rather large pieces of Mopani driftwood that you can buy. Now, it does suffer from some of the same problems that Malaysian driftwood suffers from, and that is when we're talking about all these different types of woods and what looks interesting, while it is definitely more interesting looking than Malaysian driftwood, it can still appear rather chunky. Now, in terms of price, usually the Mopani is going to be a little bit more expensive than the Malaysian driftwood. It is just as common. It's relatively easy to find. When it comes to releasing tannins, I would say it doesn't release quite as much in the water in regard to the quantity, but it's still going to be pretty excessive and right behind the Malaysian driftwood in terms of tannin release. Now, one thing that I think it does, well, a little bit more than the Malaysian driftwood is it does get that white film all over the surface a little bit more than the Malaysian driftwood does. One thing that it does a little bit better than the Malaysian driftwood is because it's a harder wood, it's not going to fall apart nearly as fast. So years down the road, when your Malaysian driftwood is kind of broken off into pieces, it's gotten really kind of soft and you have to remove it from the aquarium, The Mopani driftwood being a harder wood, it's not going to break apart quite as easily. And again, if you want to learn how to add driftwood to your aquarium safely, check out the video in the upper right-hand corner. We talk about how to make sure that your driftwood is in good shape before you put it into the aquarium. Now, these next types of woods, they're not quite as bulky and chunky. In this first one, I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to show you what this looks like in an aquarium. This little guy here is a really good example of Manzanita wood. Manzanita tends to be very spiky, very thin, very branchy looking. This is nice because it can fill up a lot of space in an aquarium without being really large and chunky. Now, with the Manzanita wood, a couple of advantages is it does provide a lot of visual interest because you can get different types of pieces, you can mix and match them, glue them together. It works out really well. The other cool thing is it has an interesting color where it looks lighter in color when you first put it in an aquarium, but once you actually get it in the water, it tends to look a lot darker. Now, one downside compared to the Mopani and the Malaysian Driftwood, this stuff tends to float way, way more than those heavier types of woods. Both the Mopani and the Malaysian Driftwood, especially if you soak them or boil them, they tend to sink right away. With the Manzanita wood, it will definitely float unless you boil it or you soak it or you tie it down or glue it to rocks to make it stay down. And that is definitely something that we've had to do in our fish room. We either place rocks on top of the wood to keep it down until it gets waterlogged, or we glue it with super glue to rocks to keep it down in the aquarium. The other thing when it comes to the Manzanita wood is you are going to get a considerable amount of that white fuzzy stuff that grows on wood after a few days after putting it in the aquarium. Again, it does go away. Just keep that in mind. Manzanita wood does not release nearly as many tannins into the water as both the Malaysian and the Mopani driftwood does. However, it can be costly, so keep that in mind as well when you're looking for Manzanita wood. It can cost a little bit more than the Malaysian and the Mopani. Other thing to keep in mind is the Manzanita wood does have sharp edges, and so if you're going to be putting this in an aquarium where you've got fish that are going to be really, really fast swimmers or with long fins, this may not be the best option for you. Next one up on the list, and that is this Spiderwood. I love this type of wood. It is one of my favorites on the list, just full disclosure. And I love it because, to me, it has the most interesting shape. You've got these long parts that stick out. You've got some thicker regions of this type of wood. And I absolutely love that contrast. You can put a lot of these together, glue them to rocks, and get some really, really interesting shapes out of Spiderwood. Now, this is a lighter colored wood that once again will turn darker once it gets into the aquarium. Just like the Manzanita, it does have that white growth after you put it in the aquarium. You're definitely going to want to sink this stuff. You're definitely going to want to float it or boil it, just because it does tend to float. And so again, gluing it to rocks or placing rocks on top of the wood will help keep it down until it gets waterlogged. Once it does, not a problem. It does not release a whole lot of tannins into the aquarium. So similar to Manzanita, it's not going to turn your water nearly as brown, although all driftwood will turn your water brown to a certain extent if you don't boil it or soak it first. But the Manzanita and the Spiderwood does that less so. One of the main things I love about this wood is you can crack off pieces, you can cut off little pieces just to make the wood fit however you want it to. And like I said, visually speaking, it is some of the more interesting wood that is out there today. Now, there are some sharper edges to this wood. It's not quite as bad as the Manzanita, but it is something to keep in mind. Again, if you've got fish that like to panic, or they spook easily, or they're really super active, or you've got long-finned fish. The other thing I like about this wood is if you have larger aquariums, because you can put multiple pieces together, it can fill a lot of volume without having that chunky, blocky look, a lot like the Manzanita wood does. Now, something to keep in mind, we've talked about Malaysian driftwood and how that falls apart and gets softer over time. The Mopani is a harder wood that doesn't do that. The Manzanita and the Spiderwood, to a certain extent, some of these smaller pieces might get soft and brittle over time and start to fall off. I don't think it's nearly as bad as the Malaysian driftwood, but it is something to keep in mind. Sometimes you'll lose a couple of these branches. They just might crack off over time. Next on the list, and I find this to be very interesting wood, and especially if you've got larger tanks, you can get larger pieces. This is Ghostwood. You can see again here, it's a lighter type of wood that will turn darker once you put it in the aquarium. Now, Ghostwood is really cool because you get these larger, thicker pieces. And so in some ways, it's kind of like a mix between the size and the bulkiness of a Malaysian or a Mopani, but it gives you the branching patterns often of, let's say, a Manzanita or a Spiderwood. A couple things though. One, it does release some tannins into the water, but I don't think nearly as much as pretty much anything else on the list. So if you're looking for a wood that is going to keep your water least impacted by tannins, Ghostwood might be a really great option for you. Second thing is, it's still a relatively harder wood, even though it has branching patterns, and so that's nice. It doesn't fall apart as quickly. There is going to be a considerable amount of white growth on the driftwood after you add it, but again, that will usually go away after a couple of weeks. Another thing to consider is it does float fairly easily, especially for a wood its size. Of all the woods that we talk about, I would say this one is actually the most challenging to keep submerged in the tank. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, it is a larger piece of wood, so it's a little bit harder to soak and certainly harder to boil, to waterlog it to keep it in the tank. Two, once you've got it situated and you start filling up the tank, it is really important to either weigh it down with rocks or glue it to rocks and glue it to each other to try to keep it in place. But because it is so large and it has a tendency to float, sometimes if you don't use enough glue, it will break off and then you'll have a big piece of wood floating in your tank, and that can be rather annoying. So just keep in mind when you put the Ghostwood in your aquarium, it's really important. Make sure you've glued it to rock, make sure you've weighed it down or really waterlogged it, because this wood, unlike any other wood that we talk about, will probably have the highest tendency to float. Now, this next type of wood, pound for pound, might be the most expensive wood that we talk about in this video, and that is the bonsai tree or the bonsai wood. Really cool looking, right? I mean, there's a ton of interest here. You can get these in larger pieces, although typically they stay on the smaller side, but these can get expensive in a hurry. A piece like this sometimes goes for $30 or $40, and this, if all you had in here was just this piece, you would be lucky to fill a 5-gallon and make it look proportional. So really good wood if you've got that 3-gallon, 5-gallon, and even a 10-gallon will work just fine. Or if you want maybe like an accent piece of wood and a 20 long, this can work, but really expensive. Now, some things. One, it does have a thicker portion, so just boiling this or floating or soaking it for a while should get it to sink pretty decently. Second thing is, in terms of releasing tannins, typically it doesn't release a lot of tannins. Again, all wood is going to release some tannins into the water to make it appear a little bit more brown. This wood, I would say, does that to a minimal extent. Next thing to consider is you have a lot of sharp edges here on this bonsai tree, and so be careful again with fast-moving fish and also fish with long fins, because they could get injured on all of these sharper edges. What a lot of people like to do with this wood is cover it with Java moss and make it look like a tree from a forest. You get a bunch of these together and it can have a really cool impact on your aquarium. This is a great wood for shrimp as well. They like to crawl throughout all of these little crevices and areas here, so that's pretty awesome. You are going to, like I said, you're going to get some white growth on this wood. It's not nearly as bad as what you see with some of the other wood that we've already talked about today. Next one on the list, and that's this Cho Wood here. This is really cool. And so Cho Wood usually is an accent piece. It's not something that you would usually use as a large center piece for your aquascape, but often this is just a piece that is kind of just laying on the substrate or kind of in the background a little bit. It's got all these little holes here, and so for shrimp keepers, this is really important because smaller shrimplets, they can go in here and hide. Often there's biofilms that grow on here that are really important for shrimp and snails. They can consume, especially if you're breeding fish. The fry will sometimes go in here, seek protection, and also, again, feed on the biofilms in here. This wood is almost guaranteed to float. It's one of the floatiest woods, if you will, out there. So definitely, if you want this stuff to sink, go ahead and soak it or boil it. It will release some tannins. It's not excessive, but it does release tannins. So again, if you want to minimize that, boil it or float it for a while to get some of those tannins out ahead of time. It's a very cheap wood in terms of price. It's relatively inexpensive. And so from all the wood that we've talked about today, this is probably going to be on the cheaper end. And so maybe you're somebody who's got primarily plants or rocks and you just want to add a little bit of wood. This might be a really nice option for you. It comes in lots of different sizes. You can get them anywhere from around 4 inches, and then you've got the larger pieces like this. And I've actually seen them much thicker and much wider, where you could actually have some nanocichlids use them as caves for potentially spawning. So there is a wide variety of sizes. Now, if there's a downside to the Cho wood, it does break down relatively rapidly. I would say of all the wood types that we've talked about today, the Cho wood probably breaks down the fastest. And so this is not a wood that you're going to throw in your tank and 5 or 6 years from now expect it to still be there. Usually by that point, it's broken down. You might still have little chunks of the wood left over, but it's probably not going to look like this. There is one other type of wood that I want to mention in this video, because from time to time it appears in some pet stores, and it's really a wood that is more appropriate for a lizard setup than it is a fish tank, and that is Grape Vine. Grape Vine is a very interesting wood, and I think that's why people really are drawn to it, and they want to put that in an aquarium because it's got that nice twisty shape to it. It's a very interesting pattern. However, it releases an excessive amount of organic materials. I had the misfortune of putting Grape Vine in an aquascape at Aquashella one time, and the tank was absolutely destroyed. And it was extremely stressful because we put the Grape Vine in there, not realizing that it was going to be such a big problem. The next morning, I had a whole bunch of fish that were all gasping for air at the top. The tank was really, really cloudy. It wasn't tannin stained. It was just had a white, milky appearance. I did an 80% water change. I had to do that 3 times the next day just to keep those fish alive. And then another 2 times the following day on that Sunday. Grape Vine is just not a wood that I would recommend putting in an aquarium. Even when you soak it, it still releases a lot of organic compounds. It takes available oxygen away from fish, and it is just a bad idea in general. So if you see that at a pet store, again, I would just use that for maybe a paludarium. You might use that for lizards in a enclosure, but not something I would necessarily put in an aquarium. People always ask, can you put driftwood from a lake or a river into your aquarium? And my response always is risk versus reward. There could be bacteria, there could be pathogens on that wood that you will now be introducing into your aquarium that your fish have never been exposed to. That could be a potential nightmare. So for me personally, I don't take driftwood directly out of a lake or a river and put it in my aquarium. I just don't think it's worth the risk. There are lots of other types of woods out there. Not all of them are safe. These are the most common, most popular types of driftwood that you can put in your aquarium. Would love to hear from you in the comments section below. What are your favorites? And if you want more information about how to care for driftwood and how to prep it, check out that video in the upper right-hand corner. We talk about how to get that white fluffy stuff off of driftwood. And then in the lower right-hand corner, how to prep it before you put it in your aquarium. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you in the next one.